There's a specific kind of silence that follows when someone dies in the middle of a sentence they never got to finish. Not a battlefield death, not a long illness with time to say goodbye, just a phone call that ends normally, followed hours later by the kind of message nobody's ready for. That's how Lindsey Graham's 4 decades in American public life ended. Not with a farewell speech, with a phone call about a voting bill. Here's what actually happened, and why it matters more than the headlines managed to capture in the first 24 hours of shock. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina died suddenly on Saturday night at 71, his office confirmed, just hours after returning from a trip to Ukraine. The D.C. medical examiner's preliminary finding was aortic dissection, caused by arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease. In plainer terms, a tear in the wall of his aorta, the kind of event that can end a life in minutes with no real warning. Paramedics were called to his Washington home after reports of chest discomfort. They performed CPR at the scene before rushing him to George Washington University Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. That's the medical story, and it's worth stating plainly, because Graham's sudden death almost immediately triggered a wave of baseless online speculation. Claims of foreign assassination, foul play, conspiracy theories built on nothing but the timing of his travel schedule. Fact-checkers traced all of it back to the same unremarkable, tragic explanation: a ruptured aorta, confirmed by a medical examiner with nothing pointing to anything else. Sometimes the most powerful people in the world die the same way anyone else does. No plot required. What makes this loss land differently isn't a mystery. It's timing, and it's the phone call. Trump told NBC's Kristen Welker that Graham had called him around 7 o'clock that evening, shortly after landing from Ukraine, and that it may have been one of the senator's very last conversations. The subject wasn't foreign policy, which had defined most of Graham's career. It was the Save America Act. Graham was, in Trump's words, pushing the Save America Act like crazy, telling the president, "We're all set on the bill." Trump recalled Graham telling him he felt tired but otherwise fine. "A little bit tired, but perfect," is how the president put it, before the two talked about meeting up again the next day. That meeting never happened. Graham's office confirmed his death publicly at 2:02 a.m. Eastern. Hours after that call, "I got a message about 1 o'clock in the morning from one of the people at his office that he had passed away," Trump said. "I just can't believe it." There's no secret document in that story. No handoff, no hidden dossier. Just an old ally, freshly back from a war zone he'd flown into on behalf of American foreign policy, spending some of his last hours on Earth still working the phones for a bill he believed in. If you want the real headline, that's it. Lindsey Graham died the way he lived, mid-task, still pushing. To understand why that detail carries weight, you have to understand what the Save America Act actually is, and why Graham, of all people, was the one still lobbying for it hours before his death. The bill, formerly the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, would require documentary proof of U.S. citizenship to register to vote in federal elections, along with photo identification at the ballot box. It passed the House back in April of 2025, and then it sat. By late January of this year, House Republicans were publicly complaining it had collected dust in the Senate for nearly 300 days. Stalled specifically in the Rules and Administration Committee, despite what supporters described as near-unanimous backing among Senate Republicans. By this month, the bill was finally being actively debated on the Senate floor, which is exactly the moment Graham, fresh off an international trip, chose to spend part of his evening making sure it stayed moving. Congress has since begun weighing a scaled-back version through the budget reconciliation process, with the House setting aside $10 billion in incentive funding tied to states adopting the citizenship and ID requirements in its July 15th budget resolution. It's worth being straight about where the fight over this bill actually stands, because it isn't a settled question and it deserves to be presented as both sides would frame it, not just one. Supporters argue this is common-sense election integrity. An October 2024 Gallup poll found 83% of voters support requiring proof of citizenship to register, and that it closes a real vulnerability in a self-attestation system. Opponents counter that the vulnerability being closed is largely theoretical. Utah, cited as one of the most comprehensive state-level citizenship reviews conducted anywhere, examined more than 2 million registered voters and found exactly one confirmed instance of non-citizen registration and 0 instances of non-citizen voting. Critics also warned the bill would disrupt mail and online registration methods that millions of Americans currently rely on, and note that a Senate floor amendment pushed by Trump allies sought to add further restrictions on mail voting specifically. Both of those facts are true at once. That tension, real public support for the concept, against thin evidence of the underlying problem it claims to solve, is exactly the fight Graham was still working that phones on the night he died. Now widen the lens, because Graham's death isn't just about one bill. It closes out one of the more improbable arcs in modern Republican politics. First elected to the Senate in 2002, Graham spent more than 2 decades evolving alongside and eventually inside the Trump-era Republican Party, becoming one of the president's closest advisors on Capitol Hill, even as he remained, at heart, an old-school foreign policy hawk who often broke with the more isolationist wing of Trump's base. That evolution is almost hard to believe in hindsight. Graham once called Trump a kook, crazy, and unfit for office during the 2016 primary, before becoming one of his most reliable allies in the Senate. That contradiction was, in a lot of ways, the whole story of Graham's career. A man capable of bitter disagreement who somehow kept the relationships intact anyway. Vice President J.D. Vance put it almost exactly that way in his tribute. "We certainly had our disagreements, but I couldn't help but like him." Graham chaired the Senate Budget Committee and sat on both Judiciary and Appropriations, a portfolio that gave him real influence over federal spending, judicial confirmations, and oversight, right up until the end. Senate Majority Leader John Thune praised his decades of military and public service and his belief in the might of America to achieve good in the world, and noted that his influence on the federal judiciary, national defense, and South Carolina will be felt for generations. He was, at the time of his death, running for a 5th Senate term. That's the part that turns personal loss into immediate political consequence. Cite name 84-1 under South Carolina law. A special primary election is expected to be held August 11th, with a possible runoff on August 25th to choose Graham's eventual successor, though officials had not, as of the days immediately following his death, finalized the process. Cite in the interim, Governor Henry McMaster will appoint a replacement to serve until January 3rd, 2027, and the jockeying for that seat began almost immediately. Zoom out, and here's the actual shape of the story. Not a conspiracy, not a hidden handoff, but something more ordinary and, in its own way, more affecting. A 71-year-old senator who flew home from a war zone, called the president to talk shop about a bill he believed in, told him he was tired but fine, and then simply didn't wake up to see whether that bill passed. The Save America Act would still require voters to provide documentary proof of citizenship to register in federal elections. That fight continues without him. South Carolina Republicans will spend the next several weeks fighting over who inherits his seat. That fight is only beginning. What's already finished is the career of a man whose signature trait, by his own colleague's account, was that he never really stopped working, right down to his final phone call. 3 things worth watching from here. First, whether the Save America Act's momentum in the Senate survives the loss of one of its most persistent advocates, or whether it stalls again the way it did for those nearly 300 days last year. Second, how South Carolina's special primary process plays out over the coming weeks, and who Governor McMaster names as interim successor before that vote. Third, and this one's less about politics than about pattern, watch how Washington absorbs the loss of one of its last remaining bridge builders between factions that increasingly don't talk to each other at all. That's a harder vacancy to fill than a Senate seat. Graham spent his last conversation with the president talking about unfinished business. In the end, that's what he left behind. Not a secret, not a mystery, just a piece of work he never got to see through.